By 1943, the Army understood something was wrong with the sidearm situation in the Pacific. Not wrong in the sense of total failure, wrong in the more dangerous way institutions often mean it. The weapons still existed, the regulations still worked, the paperwork still looked clean, but the men in the field were fighting a kind of war that exposed the gap between official assumptions and actual survival. What the Army did with that understanding became a perfect example of how procurement systems defend old decisions instead of confronting new realities. The M1 carbine had entered service in 1942 as what appeared to be the ideal answer. It was lighter than the M1 Garand. It carried a 15-round magazine. It fired the .30 carbine cartridge, a 110-grain bullet at roughly 1,990 feet per second. On paper, it seemed to fill the exact space Pacific combat demanded, bridging the distance between a heavy rifle and a limited-capacity pistol. In theory, it solved the problem. In practice, it created a new one. Veterans from the Pacific repeatedly described the .30 carbine as fast, easy to carry, and effective at intermediate range. But when the fight collapsed into the jungle's closest distances, when a charging enemy appeared through darkness and brush at the edge of a foxhole, many did not trust it the way they trusted the .45. It could kill. No one denied that. But killing and stopping are not always the same thing in the second that matters most. SLAW, Marshall's post-Korea weapons study, recorded that infantry troops consistently rated the .45 automatic superior to the carbine for close-range fighting. That preference was not cultural nostalgia. It tracked directly to what happened when Japanese infantry got inside American lines. The carbine performed at distance. The pistol cartridge was what men trusted at the breach point. At the instant the perimeter gave way and the fight became hand-to-hand, body-to-body, muzzle to torso. The Army's response was revealing. Rather than fully absorb what field troops were saying, doctrine emphasized the carbine's value at intermediate ranges. The problem was not solved, it was reframed. The men writing policy in Washington dealt with battlefield contradiction by redefining the conditions under which the weapon should be used. The soldiers in the Pacific did not get to choose their conditions. Japanese assaults chose them instead. At the same time, requests from Pacific commanders for more pistol ammunition moved through a supply system that treated .45 ACP exactly the way the doctrine treated the pistol itself. As secondary, as lower priority, as something useful but not decisive, that bureaucratic assumption had real consequences in combat. In a Marine rifle platoon on Bougainville in 1943, there might be only 2 or 3 M1911A, 1 pistols among 30 men. When resupply came forward, priority went to M1 Garand ammunition, to 30 Browning rounds for machine guns, to mortar ammunition, to the weapons the system officially considered decisive. The man carrying the pistol knew what it meant when fighting close to arm's length. The system behind him did not. That misunderstanding shaped every level of the war. Resupply decisions, doctrine memoranda, procurement studies, formal evaluations written between 1942 and 1945 by people who often had never stood inside a breached perimeter at night. The Japanese Army's fear of the .45 ACP did not come from legend alone. It came from contact, direct contact. It came from what happened when that round was fired under the exact conditions the Pacific War produced again and again. Banzai charges were not isolated acts of desperation. They were a recurring tactical reality across the campaign. Formal mass infantry assaults launched at close range under the belief that speed, shock, and numbers could break American positions before firepower could fully stop them. At Attu in May of 1943, at Tarawa in November of 1943, at Saipan in June of 1944. The pattern repeated across islands, across months, across the same terrible terrain. At range, American firepower was devastating. The M1 Garand, the 30 Browning machine guns, mortars, artillery. All of them tore apart attacking formations before they reached the line. But war does not end at range just because doctrine prefers it there. Some attackers got through. Some got into the trenches, the command posts, the gaps between foxholes, the tight black spaces where a rifle becomes awkward and seconds become everything. That is where the weapon on a man's hip became the weapon that mattered most. The largest banzai charge of the Pacific War came on Saipan on the 7th of July, 1944. Roughly 4,000 Japanese soldiers struck the lines of the 27th Infantry Division near Tanapag in the early morning darkness. They overran multiple positions. It was one of those moments when battle no longer moves in organized shapes. It breaks apart, it surges. Men fight wherever they are standing because there is nowhere left to fall back. What stopped that attack in the end was a combination of artillery called in dangerously close to American lines and the stubborn resistance of individual soldiers using whatever weapons remained in their hands. At the breach points, where rifle ammunition was exhausted and fighting dropped into foxholes and torn positions, surviving accounts recorded the same pattern over and over. Soldiers firing the M1911. A 1 at attackers entering their positions described a consistent result. A man hit in the torso at close range by a 230-grain 45 ACP round usually did not continue forward. The impact produced an immediate visible stopping effect. Not theoretical, not laboratory language, visible, instant, final enough to matter. That effect came from the very qualities critics often dismissed. Large diameter, heavy bullet weight, relatively low velocity. The round transferred energy in a way men could see in front of them, in conditions where there was no time to argue ballistics and no room for abstract theories. Across 3 years of island fighting, on multiple islands, in multiple units, survivors kept describing the same thing because they had all met the same problem in the dark. Japanese soldiers and officers who survived the Pacific Campaign later described the American pistol in similar terms. In post-war accounts and wartime interrogations, it appeared as one of the weapons most feared at the worst possible point in battle, when the perimeter broke and combat collapsed into hand-to-hand range. The cartridge, built decades earlier to stop a charging insurgent, armed with a bolo knife, had found its exact conditions again, in a different war, on different islands, under a different sky. That is what made the contradiction so striking. Thomson-Lagarde Commission had reached its conclusion in 1904 through grim experimentation and battlefield logic. The Army procurement system, over the decades that followed, quietly allowed that conclusion to become something like a historical artifact, a solved question, a relic of another era. But for the soldiers who survived Saipan, for the men inside those overrun positions on the 7th of July, 1944, it was not history at all. It was living fact. And still, the institution struggled to absorb what the battlefield kept proving. The system had a pistol that worked. It had decades of evidence that explained why it worked. It had soldiers in active combat confirming the same lesson under the harshest possible conditions. Yet logistics treated its ammunition as secondary. Doctrine treated its role as secondary. Procurement tried to solve its limitations without fully admitting why men trusted it in the first place. This is how armies forget. Not by denying reality outright, but by filing it beneath categories that no longer match the war being fought. Not by throwing away good weapons, but by misunderstanding the exact reason they still matter. The men in the foxholes did not misunderstand it. They knew the difference between a weapon that looked correct on paper and a weapon that stopped a charge in darkness. They knew because they had seen men keep moving, and they had seen what finally made them stop. The 45 ACP never truly disappeared from American service, no matter how many times official policy tried to move past it. For more than 7 decades, the U.S. military kept searching for something newer, lighter, higher capacity, more standardized, and for more than 7 decades, the old question kept coming back in the same brutal form. What actually stops a man at close range when there is no time left for theory? In 1985, the Army adopted the 9mm Parabellum as its standard sidearm cartridge when the Beretta M9 replaced the M1911A1. The official justification sounded modern, rational, and difficult to argue against. NATO standardization, greater magazine capacity, 15 rounds of 9mm against 7 rounds of 45. On paper, the decision made sense. The old stopping power debate was treated as settled. With improved ammunition design, the argument went, the smaller round could perform comparably while giving troops more shots before reloading. But the men in the units most likely to fight at intimate distance were never fully convinced. Delta Force did not completely abandon the 45. SEAL teams, Army Special Forces elements, and Marine Raider units continued to keep 45 caliber weapons in their inventories through the 1990s and into the post-9/11 era. That was not sentimentality. It was not nostalgia for a famous pistol. It was the same pattern seen again and again throughout military history. The closer a unit operates to the point of sudden violence, the less impressed it becomes by abstract arguments detached from the exact conditions of the fight. Then came another moment that forced institutions to revisit an argument they believed they had already closed. The FBI Miami shootout in 1986 left 2 agents dead after suspects continued fighting despite taking multiple 9mm hits. That event triggered a major ballistics review that reshaped terminal performance standards for both law enforcement and military thinking. The review concluded that bullet diameter, penetration depth, and wound cavity size all matter. Not one factor, several. Together, the same core variables the Thompson-Lagarde Commission had wrestled with back in 1904, long before modern jargon gave the debate a more technical vocabulary. Eventually, the FBI returned to the 9mm with improved ammunition, but the framework it built quietly validated what Pacific veterans had been saying for decades. Velocity alone does not guarantee immediate stopping reliability. Not at close range, not when the target is determined, not when the fight is unfolding in seconds, and the difference between a fatal wound and an immediate stop can determine who is still standing long enough to fire again. In 2012, the Marine Corps formally reissued an M1911 variant to select units, specifically citing close-quarters combat requirements in urban environments in Iraq and Afghanistan. That detail matters. It matters because it shows that the logic behind the 45 never belonged to one war alone. The environment changed from jungle to city blocks. The enemy changed. The uniforms changed. The technology changed. But the essential problem remained familiar. Tight spaces, sudden contact, split-second violence. The need for a sidearm that could end the fight immediately when everything had already gone wrong. Then in 2017, the Army adopted the Sig Sauer P 320 and 9mm as the M17, formally ending the M9 era. Once again, standardization and capacity carried the day. Once again, special operations units retained discretion over sidearm selection, and once again, many of them kept choosing 45 caliber weapons. That alone says more than most procurement reports ever will. Because the true lesson of the 45 ACP is not that larger is always better. It is not that every old design deserves eternal loyalty. And it is not that institutions are always wrong. The deeper lesson is harsher than that. Soldiers who have lived through a specific kind of fight almost always know something the doctrine writers do not. They know it in their nerves, in memory, in the details that never make it cleanly into official language. The Thompson-Lagarde Commission spent months in 1904 testing bullets on cadavers and cattle. The men on Saipan answered the same question on the 7th of July, 1944, with their own lives on the line. Between those two moments stretched decades of paperwork, doctrine, procurement cycles, and bureaucratic forgetting. Yet both groups arrived at the same conclusion by different roads. In the kind of close combat where seconds decide everything, immediate stopping effect is not a luxury. It is survival. And still, the men who had to depend on that fact were too often forced to argue with the system behind them. They had to fight for ammunition, fight against doctrine that categorized their weapon as secondary, fight procurement logic that treated combat reality as an administrative inconvenience. The battlefield kept producing the same answer, but institutions kept trying to file that answer away, under changing labels and modern assumptions. That is why the story does not end with calibers or pistols alone. It ends with the men who carried them. Private First Class Harold Agerholm of the 2nd Marine Division earned the Medal of Honor on Saipan that July. His citation records that he found an abandoned Jeep ambulance and drove it again and again across ground swept by rifle and mortar fire, loading and evacuating approximately 45 casualties over more than 3 hours before a Japanese sniper killed him. He was 19 years old. The award was posthumous. His story was not about sidearm theory, but it belonged to the same world, a world where survival depended on what worked, not on what looked elegant inside a memorandum. The men who carried the 45 into the worst fighting of the Pacific did not need a commission to tell them it worked. They did not need a briefing paper. They did not need a polished explanation from Washington. They needed ammunition. They needed trust. They needed a system willing to learn from the men who had already paid for that knowledge in mud, darkness, and blood. That is the real history of the 45 ACP, not a museum piece, not a nostalgic legend, a weapon born from one failure, proven in one war, questioned by bureaucracy, and then vindicated again when combat stripped away every illusion, again and again. The lesson returned in the same unforgiving language. At the point where a line breaks and the fight becomes personal, what matters is not what is newest. It is what stops the charge. If this is the kind of military history you want, the kind built from battlefield reality, hard evidence, and the gap between doctrine and survival, stay with us for the next story. There is always another weapon, another battle, another truth the paperwork never fully captured.